This slide tries to answer the question of whether there is experimental evidence for double slip. And so the red squares here in all of these three figures are from experimental measurements of permeability. And then there is also the pore size distribution for those samples that were used in these three cases. So this one has an average pore size of about this value, right? Which is like 0.3 micrometers. This has a mode of about 0.003 micrometers and so on. And then at these different average pore sizes, we see that the data lies on different stems in these type curve. So the authors of that paper, which I mentioned before, which is Fathy, Tinney, and Akutlu, they created these type curves that you can use to predict the liquid permeability from this ratio given the average pore sizes. And if you read a paper and then walk through some of the practice. So here is the practice question. After reading the paper, see if you can answer these questions. But the course will continue to focus on the multi-scale modeling of unconventional resources. So I won't spend too much time on these calculations. We can talk about this if you guys are interested in class. This is the data for the exercise given on the previous slide. This is the reference pressure. The equilibrium pressure is what you care about. That's the P average you're going to be using in the plot. And this is your apparent permeability, Ka. So this is the chart you will use to solve the problem. It was created in the paper like I mentioned earlier. Now we will be talking about adsorption enhanced transport. There's reason to believe there could be significant fluxes of gas molecules right by the pore walls. And you also know that right by the pore walls, you have lots more gas molecules due to adsorption. And what Sansang and Akutlu did to study this effect was to have two boxes separated by a nanotube. So those two boxes are going to be representative of equilibrium conditions. So they made the boundaries periodic. So you have periodic boundary conditions in those boxes. And the next thing they did to allow molecules move in this direction is to move this boundary at a specific rate. So they're moving this boundary at a specific rate, which will basically reduce the volume available for the molecules, and then they will be pushed through this nanotube into this. And to keep the system in about the same kind of average pressure, they allowed the periodic boundary condition on this other end to also move at the same rate at which this is moving in. So the average pressure of the system is kind of the same. And what you have is molecules moving through this nanotube, and then they will plot the velocity profile in this direction. Also plot the density and convert the velocity and density to flux. Rho v is flux. And so these are the molecules here. That's the nano channel, and this wall is allowed to move in and the other wall allowed to move out, and then the result. These are the simulation results. On the left you have the densities plotted against the pore size going from -3 to 3, so it's about 6 nanometers wide. And on the right you're looking at the velocity plotted against the distance from the center of the capillary. Why are there multiple lines? because we are showing different pressure differences. So the pressure difference between the first box and the other box, this delta P, the difference between this pressure and this pressure, is what is shown here. And then it can be converted to PSI per nanometer, which will be pressure gradient across this nanotube. And those are the pressures shown here. We just have lots more of them. And pressure gradients, they were all performed at the same temperature conditions. So these densities show that you have lots more gas molecules by the walls, right? That's expected. We already discussed those previously due to adsorption. But here you're looking at the flow velocities. The velocities appear to be fastest in the middle of the pore and not necessarily by the walls. But remember, rho v is flux. That's what is more important. So even though the velocities here are not fastest, there are a lot more gas molecules there. So the mass flux at the wall is actually significant. And that's what I explained here. So you have more hydrocarbon fluids by the walls, and even though the velocities are less, that product results in considerable mass flux by the walls. And that's the concept of adsorption enhanced transport. And so when we plot the mass flux against the distance from the capillary pressure, you can see that the mass flux is actually highest by the walls. And what they did here was to show the Hagen-Poiseuille's velocity, right? That can be solved for flow in pipes. That doesn't account for the flux by the walls because it assumes no slip. And this red plot is from the molecular dynamics result. Like those are the simulated velocities. And what they did was to add this flux by the walls to the Hagen-Poiseuille's flux. And that gives you this green line, which pretty much kind of averages the simulated result. And so they are coming up with this assumption that, or hypothesis, that if you add the Hagen-Poiseuille's velocity for no slip to the adsorbed phase velocity, then you can get the bulk velocity which we obtain from molecular dynamics in red.